the haunting road trip. My name is Mike, and I need to tell you about the most horrifying experience of my life. It all started when my friends and I decided to go on a road trip across the country. There were four of us: me, my girlfriend Lisa, my best friend Tom, and his sister Emily. We had just graduated from college and wanted to celebrate before life got serious. Little did we know, this trip would change us forever. We started our journey from Boston, our car packed with snacks, camping gear, and a sense of adventure. Our plan was to drive to the Grand Canyon, taking scenic routes and exploring small towns along the way. It was supposed to be the perfect summer adventure. Things were going smoothly until we reached a small town in Pennsylvania. The GPS suggested a shortcut through a less traveled route, promising picturesque views and faster travel time. Against our better judgment, we took the detour. The road was narrow and winding, surrounded by dense forests that seemed to close in on us. As night fell, a thick fog rolled in, reducing our visibility to almost nothing. We drove slowly, our headlights barely cutting through the murk. Suddenly, out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes and the car screeched to a halt. We all sat in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what had just happened. The figure was gone, vanished into the fog. "Did you see that?" Tom asked, his voice shaking. We all nodded, unsure of what to say. We continued driving, our nerves on edge. After what felt like hours, we saw a dim light in the distance. It was a small, rundown gas station. We decided to stop and ask for directions, hoping to get back on track. As we pulled in, an old man stepped out from behind the counter. He looked weathered, with deep-set eyes that seemed to pierce right through us. "Lost, are ya?" he asked, his voice gravely. We explained our situation, and he gave us a map, marking a route that would supposedly get us back to the main highway. "Be careful out there," he warned as we left. "Strange things happen on these roads at night." We thanked him and got back in the car, his words lingering in the air like a bad omen. Following the old man's directions, we found ourselves on an even narrower road, surrounded by thick woods. The fog had lifted slightly, but the darkness felt oppressive. Lisa and Emily were both on edge, while Tom tried to keep the mood light with jokes that fell flat. That's when we saw it. A large old house looming in the darkness, its windows boarded up and paint peeling. It looked like something straight out of a horror movie. "Let's just keep going," I said, my voice betraying my fear. But as we passed the house, the car's engine sputtered and died. We were stranded. We tried everything to get it started again, but it was no use. We were stuck in the middle of nowhere, with no cell service and no idea what to do. Against our better judgment, we decided to check out the house, hoping to find help, or at least shelter for the night. As we approached, the air grew colder and an eerie silence surrounded us. The front door creaked open with a push, revealing a dark, dusty interior. We ventured inside, our flashlights casting long shadows on the walls. The house was filled with old furniture, covered in cobwebs and dust. It looked like no one had lived there for decades. "Let's just find a place to sleep and wait for morning," Emily suggested, her voice barely a whisper. We found a small room with a few old, moth-eaten blankets and settled in for the night, but sleep was elusive. Strange noises echoed through the house, creaks, whispers, and the occasional thud. I tried to convince myself it was just the old house settling, but deep down, I knew something was wrong. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of footsteps. I sat up, heart pounding, and saw a shadowy figure standing in the doorway. It was the same figure we had seen on the road. I shook Lisa awake, and she gasped when she saw it too. We woke Tom and Emily, and the four of us huddled together, terrified. The figure moved closer, and we could see it more clearly. A tall, gaunt man with hollow eyes and a sinister smile. "Get out!" he whispered, his voice cold and menacing. We bolted out of the room, running through the dark house, trying to find the exit. The figure followed us, its footsteps echoing behind us. We finally burst out of the house and ran to the car. Miraculously, the engine roared to life and we sped away, the house disappearing into the darkness. We didn't stop until we reached the nearest town, collapsing in a diner, exhausted and shaken. We tried to make sense of what had happened, but it felt like a nightmare. The old man's warning, the haunted house, the figure, it all seemed too surreal. We eventually made it to the Grand Canyon, but The trip was marred by the horrors we had experienced. We never spoke of it again, each of us trying to forget the terror of that night. But deep down, we knew that something had followed us from that house, something that would haunt us forever. To this day, I can't drive at night without feeling a chill down my spine. The memory of those hollow eyes and that sinister smile still haunts my dreams. If you ever find yourself on a lonely road and an old man warns you of strange things happening at night, listen to him. You never know what horrors might be lurking in the darkness. The Endless Road. My name is Jake, and what I'm about to tell you might sound like a nightmare, but I assure you, it was real. It started when my friends and I decided to take a road trip before we all headed off to different colleges. There were 4 of us: me, my girlfriend Sarah, my best friend Matt, and his girlfriend Emily. We planned to drive from New York to California, taking the scenic route and camping along the way. We loaded up my old Jeep with supplies and hit the road, eager for adventure. The first few days were amazing. We drove through beautiful landscapes, stopped at quirky roadside attractions, and camped under the stars. It felt like we were on top of the world. Around the 5th day, we were driving through rural Kansas when Matt suggested a shortcut he found on an old map. It promised to cut several hours off our journey. The road was called Devil's Hollow. Sarah and Emily were hesitant, but Matt and I convinced them it would be fun. As we turned onto the narrow, winding road, an uneasy feeling settled over us. The landscape changed abruptly. The lush, open fields gave way to dense, twisted trees that seemed to close in on us. The sky grew darker, even though it was still early afternoon. We drove for hours, but the road seemed to stretch on forever. The GPS lost signal, and our phones had no reception. Tension was building in the car. "We should turn back," Sarah said, her voice shaking. But the road was too narrow, and there was no place to turn around. As night fell, we saw a dim light ahead. It was a rundown gas station, the only sign of life we had seen for miles. We pulled in, hoping to get directions. An old man with a weathered face and piercing eyes stepped out. "Lost, are ya?" he asked with a grin that sent chills down my spine. We explained our situation, and he gave us a map marking a route that supposedly led back to the main highway. "Stay on the road," he warned, "and whatever you do, don't stop for anything." We thanked him and drove off, his cryptic warning echoing in our minds. Following the old man's directions, we found ourselves on an even narrower, darker road. The trees closed in, and the darkness felt almost tangible. The headlights barely cut through the inky blackness. Hours passed, but there was no sign of the highway. It felt like we were driving in circles. Tension turned to fear as strange things started happening. We saw shadows flitting through the trees and heard whispers that seemed to come from the darkness itself. "Did you hear that?" Emily asked, her voice trembling. We all nodded, too scared to speak. Then the car's engine sputtered and died. We were stranded in the middle of nowhere. Panic set in. "We need to stay calm," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. But deep down, I felt the same fear gripping all of us. We decided to wait until morning, hoping the daylight would bring some clarity. As we sat in the car, the whispers grew louder. Shadows danced around us, taking the shape of tall, gaunt figures with hollow eyes. They watched us from the darkness, their presence oppressive and terrifying. Matt, always the skeptic, decided to investigate. He stepped out of the car, flashlight in hand. "Stay here," he said, his voice firm. But as he walked away, the figures seemed to close in on him. We watched in horror as he vanished into the darkness, his flashlight falling to the ground. "Matt!" Emily screamed, but there was no response. The figures moved closer, their hollow eyes fixed on us. We locked the doors, but it felt like a futile gesture. The car was our only refuge, but it felt like a cage. Hours passed and the night seemed endless. The figures circled the car, like their whispers growing louder, filling our minds with dread. Sarah clung to me, tears streaming down her face. Emily was in shock, staring blankly ahead. As dawn approached, the figures slowly retreated, melting into the shadows. But Matt was still missing. With the first light of day, we decided to search for him. We stepped out of the car, calling his name, but the forest was silent. We found his flashlight, but there was no sign of Matt. Despair washed over us. We had to get out of there, but the car still wouldn't start. We were trapped, lost in a place that seemed to defy reality. We decided to follow the road on foot, hoping to find help. The daylight brought little comfort. The trees still loomed menacingly, and the silence was unnerving. As we walked, we found signs of other travelers, abandoned cars, torn backpacks, and discarded belongings. It was clear we were not the first to be trapped here. Hours turned into days, and our supplies dwindled. We were exhausted, hungry, and terrified. Emily's condition worsened. She was weak and delirious. One night, she wandered off into the darkness. We searched for her, but she was gone, just like Matt. It was just Sarah and me now. We kept moving, driven by sheer will to survive. But the road seemed endless, looping back on itself. We realized we were trapped in a nightmarish loop with no way out. As the days blurred together, we found ourselves back at the gas station where it all began. The old man was waiting for us, his grin wider than ever. "I told you to stay on the road," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "What do you want from us?" I shouted, desperation and anger mixing in my voice. The old man just laughed. "This place has a way of taking what it wants," he said, "and it looks like it's not done with you yet." Sarah and I survived, but we were forever changed. The road trip that started as a celebration turned into a nightmare that haunted us. Matt and Emily were gone, lost to the darkness. We never spoke of that place again, but the memories lingered. To anyone planning a road trip, I have one piece of advice. Stick to the main roads, because sometimes the shortcuts lead you to places you can never escape, and some roads are better left untraveled. The Phantom Highway. My name is David, and I need to share the most chilling experience of my life. It happened during a road trip my friends and I took after graduating from high school. We were full of excitement, ready to explore the country before parting ways for college. There were 4 of us: me, my girlfriend Jessica, my best friend Mark, and his girlfriend Ashley. We started our journey from Seattle, our car packed with everything we might need for a 2-week adventure. Our plan was to drive to the Grand Canyon, stopping at various landmarks and camping along the way. It was supposed to be the trip of a lifetime, but it turned into a nightmare I can never forget. 3 days into our trip, we were driving through Idaho when we came across a seemingly endless stretch of highway. The sun was setting, painting the sky in hues of red and orange. Mark, who was driving, suggested we take an alternate route he found on his map app, claiming it would save us a few hours. Eager to see more of the countryside, we agreed. The alternate route was a narrow, winding road called Shadow Ridge Road. As soon as we turned onto it, an uneasy feeling settled over us. The trees on either side of the road were tall and dense, their branches reaching out like twisted hands. The further we drove, the darker it became, even though it was still early evening. After an hour of driving, we saw an abandoned car on the side of the road. It looked like it had been there for a while, covered in dirt and leaves. "Should we check it out?" Ashley asked, her curiosity piqued. Mark pulled over, and we got out to investigate. The car was empty, the windows dusty, and the doors unlocked. Inside, we found an old map and some personal belongings scattered around. It looked like whoever had been driving just vanished. A shiver ran down my spine. "Let's get back on the road," I said, feeling an inexplicable sense of dread. As we continued driving, the road grew narrower, the trees closing in on us. The GPS lost signal, and our phones had no reception. Jessica was starting to get nervous, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the sound of our tires on the asphalt. Then we saw something in the road ahead. A figure stood in the middle, illuminated by our headlights. It was a woman, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. Mark slammed on the brakes, and we all stared at her in shock. "Help me," she whispered, her voice barely audible. We got out of the car, and she ran towards us, her clothes torn and dirty. "They're coming," she said, panic in her voice. "We need to go now." Before we could ask her anything, a low, guttural growl echoed through the trees. Without another word, we jumped back in the car, the woman with us, and sped off down the road. The growls grew louder, and we could see shadows moving among the trees. Jessica held the woman's hand, trying to calm her down, but she was shaking uncontrollably. "Who are they?" I asked, looking back at her. "The shadows," she replied, her eyes wide with terror. "They take people. They almost got me, but I escaped." Her words sent chills down my spine. "We had to get out of there. The road seemed endless, twisting and turning through the forest. Every now and then, we caught glimpses of dark figures running alongside the car, their eyes glowing in the darkness. Mark pushed the car to its limits, the engine roaring as we sped through the night. Just when we thought we couldn't go any further, we saw lights in the distance. We drove towards them, hoping for some semblance of civilization. We arrived at a small town, but something was off. It looked like a ghost town, the buildings old and decrepit, the streets empty. We parked the car and got out, looking around cautiously. "Where is everyone?" Ashley whispered, her voice trembling. The woman with us seemed to relax slightly, but her eyes were still wide with fear. "They come here too," she said, "but it's safer than the road." We decided to take refuge in an old motel, hoping to wait out the night. The place was dusty and abandoned, but it offered some protection. We barricaded the doors and windows, settling in for what we hoped would be a quiet night. As we tried to get some rest, strange things started happening. We heard footsteps in the hallways, whispers that seemed to come from the walls, and the constant feeling of being watched. Jessica and Ashley were terrified, and even Mark, who was usually fearless, looked uneasy. In the middle of the night, I woke up to the sound of a door creaking open. I got up to investigate, my heart pounding. I saw a shadowy figure standing at the end of the hallway, its eyes glowing in the dark. It started moving towards me, and I backed away, stumbling over my words to wake the others. We all gathered in one room, holding each other tightly. The shadows were closing in, their whispers growing louder. "We need to get out of here," Mark said, his voice filled with urgency. We grabbed our things and ran back to the car, the shadows following us. We drove through the town, the shadows close behind. The road out of the town was just as dark and winding as before, but we had no choice but to keep going. The woman with us guided Mark, telling him where to turn. Her knowledge of the road was uncanny. After what felt like hours, we saw the first light of dawn breaking through the trees. The shadows started to retreat, disappearing into the darkness. We drove until we reached a main highway, the terror of the night finally behind us. We dropped the woman off at a gas station where she thanked us and disappeared into the morning light. We never learned her name or where she came from. We continued our trip in silence, the joy of the journey overshadowed by the horrors we had faced. We made it to the Grand Canyon, but the experience had changed us. We never spoke of the woman or the shadows again. The road trip that was supposed to be a celebration of our freedom turned into a haunting memory that would stay with us forever. If you ever find yourself on a lonely road and the trees seem to close in on you, turn back. Some roads are meant to be left untraveled, and some detours lead to places where nightmares come to life.